The sound of applause that wasn't mine. The moment that finally changed everything didn't happen in a courtroom or a hospital room. It happened in my parents' driveway. 30 people stood around clapping while my sister held up a pair of Mercedes keys like she had just won something. And my father raised his glass and said the words that made my stomach turn cold. Your grandmother wanted Megan to have a strong start in life. People smiled. Someone whistled. My mother dabbed at her eyes like she was proud. And in the middle of all that applause, I was the only person who knew the truth. The car sitting in that driveway, the silver Mercedes with the oversized red bow, had been bought with my inheritance. With my grandmother's piano, the one she promised me, the one they sold while she was dying. And the worst part wasn't even the theft. It was the lie. Because they were telling everyone that Grandma had agreed to it, that she had wanted it. I stood on the edge of the crowd with my hands folded so tightly my knuckles hurt. Across the yard, my sister Megan posed for pictures beside the car. 24 years old. Designer coat. Perfect hair. The golden child of our family. She tossed her hair and laughed as Daniel, her boyfriend from a wealthy real estate family, wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Smile, someone called. Flash. More applause. My father stepped forward, beaming. She deserves it, he said loudly. Megan leaned into him like a princess accepting tribute. And I felt something inside my chest crack open. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet break. The kind that happens after years of small fractures. If you've ever been the invisible child in your own family, you probably know that feeling. The moment when you realize you've been shrinking yourself for people who never planned to see you anyway. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, staring at the driveway. Because a week earlier there had been something else in that space. Not a car. A piano. A 1892 Steinway Grand. My grandmother Eleanor's piano. The one she played in concert halls across New England when she was younger. The one she taught me on when I was 7 years old and couldn't reach the pedals yet. The one she told me clearly, firmly would be mine one day. Now, it was gone. Sold for $95,000. Turned into a luxury car so my sister could impress her boyfriend's family. And my parents thought Grandma would never find out. Because Grandma was in hospice. Because she was dying. Because they assumed she was too weak to matter anymore. But they were wrong. Very wrong. If you're listening to this right now, tell me something in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? City, state, even country. Stories like this travel farther than we ever expect. And sometimes the quiet ones listening understand the most. Because what my parents didn't know, what none of those smiling guests knew, was that 3 nights earlier, I had already told Grandma everything. And instead of crying, she reached for her phone, dialed one number, and said 7 calm words. Good. It's time they meet my lawyer. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I didn't know about the documents, or the trust, or the secret she'd been holding on to for 5 years. All I knew was that my grandmother's voice had sounded peaceful, like someone who had been waiting for something inevitable. But to understand why she reacted that way, you have to go back 2 weeks. To the Tuesday afternoon when the phone rang, and my father told me Grandma was going to hospice. That was the moment the story really began. And if you've ever watched a family reveal who they truly are when money enters the room, you already know what came next. Stay with me. Because what happened at my mother's 60th birthday party 4 days later is something no one there will ever forget. The family role I never chose. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, just after I finished my last lesson of the day. One of my students, a quiet 9-year-old named Lily, had spent 20 minutes trying to play the same 4 measures without crying. By the end, she got through them with both hands, slow and uneven, but brave. I remember kneeling beside her bench and telling her that progress usually sounded messy before it sounded beautiful. I didn't know then how much I was about to need those same words. My phone started vibrating the second Lily's mother walked her out. Dad. He rarely called unless he wanted something. I answered anyway. Grandma had another episode, he said without greeting me. They're moving her into hospice. The room went still. Even after a pause, he didn't soften. Didn't ask if I was sitting down. Didn't say he was sorry. Just, we're meeting at Street Andrews in an hour. Don't be late. Then he hung up. I stood alone in my little music studio with one hand still around the phone and the other resting on the edge of the upright piano. Outside, I could hear the usual late afternoon sounds from Main Street traffic, a bus braking, someone laughing too loudly, but inside that room, everything felt strangely muted. Hospice. There are words that don't just describe a reality, they close a door. I locked up early and drove straight to the hospital, telling myself the whole way there that doctors were sometimes wrong, that people stayed in hospice longer than expected, that maybe Grandma Eleanor would still have months, maybe more. But hope can be a very polite liar. When I got to the family waiting area, my parents were already there with Megan. My father stood with his back straight, business coat still on, like he had come from a meeting instead of a hospital. My mother sat with one leg crossed over the other, her handbag on her lap, looking inconvenienced more than shaken. Megan was leaning against the wall, scrolling on her phone, her glossy dark hair falling perfectly over one shoulder. Nobody moved toward me. Dad looked up first. Good. You're here. Not, how are you doing? Not, this is hard. Just relief that I had arrived to fill my assigned place. Mom glanced at me and said, "You took long enough." I swallowed that familiar little sting and sat down in the empty chair at the edge of their circle. Then my father cleared his throat, the way he did before dividing responsibilities in family matters, as if he were chairing a board meeting. "The doctors say she needs daily company," he said. "Someone should be with her regularly." His eyes landed on me almost immediately. Of course they did. "Your mother and I have too much on our plate right now," he continued, "and Megan has a lot going on with Daniel's family." Megan didn't even look up. Then came the sentence I could have predicted before he opened his mouth. "So you'll handle the visits, Anna." There it was. The role I had been given in this family years ago. Not the celebrated daughter. Not the admired one. Not the investment. The useful one. I nodded because that was what I had always done. And because, unlike them, I actually wanted to be there. "I'll go," I said quietly. Dad gave one sharp nod, already satisfied. "Good." Mom adjusted the bracelet on her wrist and added, "At least your schedule allows for it." My schedule. As if teaching piano lessons to children, running after-school music classes, and piecing together a living from work I loved, somehow made my time less real than theirs. I looked down at my hands before the hurt could show on my face. Some of you listening have felt that kind of dismissal before. Not loud enough to call abuse, just steady enough to make you question your value. That kind leaves a mark too. A nurse stepped into the waiting area then and said Grandma was awake for a short visit. I stood before anyone else did. Dad waved a hand. "You go first. Let us know what the doctor says afterward." Of course. I walked down the hall alone, passing muted televisions, soft shoe steps, the scent of antiseptic and wilted flowers. By the time I reached her room, I had already fallen back into the version of myself my family understood best. The quiet one. The dependable one. The one who carried pain neatly. But the moment I opened Grandma Eleanor's door and saw her near the window, pale but alert, a blanket over her legs and that familiar intelligence still bright in her face, I knew something else too. Whatever time she had left, I was not going to let her spend it surrounded by people who only loved what they could take from her. The only place I was ever seen. Grandma Eleanor's hospice room smelled faintly like lavender. That wasn't an accident. Hospice rooms usually smell like antiseptic and quiet resignation, but my grandmother had never accepted the idea that life should lose its beauty just because it was ending. "They try to make everything smell like hospitals," she had told me on my first visit, wrinkling her nose. "If I'm going to leave this world, I'd prefer to do it surrounded by things I actually like." So there were lavender sachets in the drawers, a small stack of her old music books by the window. and a photograph of her at 25 sitting proudly at a Steinway piano on a concert stage. Even now, pale against the pillows, she looked more alive than anyone else in the building. When I stepped inside, her eyes lifted immediately. "Annabelle," she said softly. "Nobody else in the family used my full name. Only her." "Hi, Grandma." I pulled a chair beside the bed and took her hand. Her skin felt thinner than I remembered, but the grip was still surprisingly strong. "You look tired," she said. "I'm okay." She gave me a look that made it clear she didn't believe that for a second. My grandmother had spent decades reading concert halls full of strangers. Reading me was easy. "They told you," she said. "Yes." A quiet moment passed between us. Outside the window, the sun was slipping lower behind the hospital parking lot, turning the glass a soft orange. Then she squeezed my hand again. "Don't look so frightened," she said gently. "I'm still here." And somehow, that made my chest tighten even more. I visited her every afternoon after that. Every day after teaching my last lesson, I drove straight to hospice. We talked about small things. Music. My students. Her memories of performing in old theaters across the Northeast when she was young. Sometimes she would close her eyes and hum along when I described a piece I'd been practicing. Other times, she would simply listen. Really listen. In a family where I had spent years feeling invisible, that alone felt like oxygen. Anyone who's grown up being overlooked knows what that kind of attention feels like. Not dramatic, not loud, just someone seeing you clearly. One evening, about a week after she entered hospice, the sky outside was deep blue and quiet when she reached for my hand again. Her expression was different that night, more serious. "Annabelle," she said. "Yes? There's something I need you to know." Her fingers tightened around mine with surprising strength. "The Steinway." My breath caught. I hadn't thought about the piano all week, not consciously, but hearing the word pulled a memory straight into the room. The piano had lived in the corner of her living room for 30 years. Black lacquer, ivory keys slightly worn from decades of practice. I had learned my very first scale, sitting beside her on that bench. "That piano," she said firmly, "belongs to you." I blinked. "Grandma." "I told your parents already," she continued calmly. "Last month, in front of everyone." I remembered that night. The way Dad's jaw tightened. The way Mom exchanged a look with Megan. And Megan rolling her eyes, like someone had announced they were inheriting a dusty bookshelf instead of a century-old Steinway. "You're the only one who understands what that instrument means," Grandma said softly. "It's part of our family's music." Her eyes searched mine. "Promise me you'll take care of it." I swallowed the sudden tightness in my throat. "I promise." She smiled then, but there was something else in that smile. Something thoughtful, almost knowing. "You'd be surprised," she murmured, "how quickly people reveal themselves when they think something valuable is up for grabs." At the time, I thought she was just reflecting on life. I didn't realize she was already preparing for something. If this story feels familiar to you, the feeling of someone quietly protecting you while others overlook you, tell me something in the comments. Type, "I understand." Because sometimes the people who appear the quietest are the ones who see the most. 2 weeks later, I stopped by her house to pick up a box of old photos she wanted to see. And that was the moment I walked into her living room and realized the piano was gone. The empty space. It was raining the afternoon I went to my grandmother's house. The kind of steady gray rain that makes everything look quieter than it really is. Grandma had asked if I could bring her a box of old pictures from her concert days she suddenly wanted to see again. She said she'd been thinking about them at night. "I'd like to remember the music," she told me over the phone. So after my last lesson that Thursday, I drove to the house. I still had a key. The place looked exactly the way it always had, from the outside white shutters, the old maple tree leaning over the driveway, the front porch that creaked in the same spot near the steps. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. Not loud. Not obvious. Just wrong. The house was too quiet. My footsteps echoed through the entryway as I walked toward the living room, already rehearsing what I'd say when I showed Grandma the photographs. And then I turned the corner. And stopped. For a few seconds, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The corner of the room was empty. Completely empty. Where the Steinway had stood for 30 years, there was nothing. Just a rectangular indentation pressed deep into the carpet where the piano's legs had rested for decades. The faint outline looked almost like a shadow, like something had been erased. I felt the air leave my lungs. "No," I whispered to the empty room. I walked forward slowly, like if I moved carefully enough, the piano might reappear. But the space stayed empty. No bench. No polished black frame. No ivory keys. Just the hollow shape left behind. My hands started shaking. I pulled my phone out and dialed my mother before I could think too much about it. She answered on the third ring. "Anna? Where's Grandma's piano?" There was a pause. Just long enough to feel intentional. "Your father handled that," she said casually. Handled. The word made my stomach twist. "What does that mean?" "It means it's taken care of," she replied. "You don't need to worry about it." My voice felt thin. "Where is it?" Another pause. Then a small sigh of irritation. "Adult matters are complicated, Anna. Leave it alone." "Did you sell it?" Silence. Then, "Your father got a very good price for it." The words echoed in my ears. "You sold it." "Anna? You sold Grandma's piano." My mother's voice hardened immediately. "It was the sensible decision." "Sensible?" I whispered. "It was just an old instrument, taking up space." That sentence landed like a slap. Anyone who has ever loved music understands that a piano isn't just furniture. It's memory. It's time. It's identity. I stared at the empty corner again. "How much?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, then said it like she was discussing a used sofa. 95,000. $95,000. My knees nearly gave out. "Where is the money?" "Your father already allocated it." Allocated. I felt like I was listening to strangers talk about someone else's life. Then my mother added something that made everything inside me go completely still. "Megan needed a car." The room tilted. "You bought her a car?" "It's important for her to make a good impression with Daniel's family," Mom said briskly. "Appearances matter." Daniel Harrison. Son of my father's most important business partner. Translation. Megan's relationship had financial value, and apparently my inheritance had just been converted into a luxury accessory. "That piano was mine," I said slowly. My mother laughed. Not loudly. Just dismissively. "Oh, Anna, don't be dramatic. It belonged to Grandma. And your grandmother isn't using it anymore." The rain tapped softly against the windows. My voice dropped to a whisper. "Does she know?" This time the silence lasted longer. Long enough to answer the question. "Anna," my mother said finally, her tone turning sharp. "Your grandmother is in hospice. She's medicated half the time. She doesn't need to be upset by pointless details." "You mean you don't want her to know?" "Watch your tone." The anger I'd spent years swallowing started to rise in my chest. "That piano was promised to me." "And what would you do with it?" she snapped. "You teach children scales after school. You don't perform. You don't have a concert hall." I closed my eyes. Some of you listening right now know that moment. The one where someone reduces your entire life's work to something small, just to make themselves feel justified. My mother's voice turned colder. "If you tell your grandmother about this, and it causes stress." She paused, then delivered the sentence she knew would hurt the most. "And something happens to her, that will be on you." The line went silent. She had hung up. I stood there, alone in the living room, staring at the ghost of the piano. And for the first time in my life, I started wondering if staying quiet was actually the worst thing I could do. The longest night. I didn't leave my grandmother's house right away. After my mother hung up, I just stood there in the living room staring at the empty space where the Steinway had been. The rain kept falling outside, a slow, steady rhythm against the windows. For a moment, I almost imagined I could still hear the piano. Not the real sound, just the memory of it. Grandma practicing Chopin in the evenings. The low, patient way she used to count out loud when I struggled with timing. Again, Annabelle. Slowly this time. I walked closer to the corner. The carpet was darker there, where the piano had shielded it from sunlight for decades. My fingers hovered above the indentation, like touching it might somehow bring the instrument back. It didn't. And the truth finally settled into my chest. They had really done it. Sold the piano. Turned it into a car. And worse than that, they had already started rewriting the story. Grandma wanted Megan to have it. Grandma was proud. Grandma approved. The lie had probably been told so many times already that by the time the truth appeared, no one would question it. Except me. And suddenly, I understood something uncomfortable. My parents hadn't just assumed Grandma wouldn't find out. They had assumed I wouldn't tell her. Because I never caused trouble. I never challenged them. I never raised my voice. For 28 years, I had played my role perfectly. The quiet daughter. The useful daughter. The one who took care of things without asking for anything in return. And that version of me had made their decision easier. Because people rarely fear the person who stays silent. I locked the house and drove home through the rain. My apartment was small. One bedroom above a bakery that started making bread at 4 in the morning. My parents liked to call it charming in the same tone people use when they mean disappointing. But that night it felt like the only place in the world where I could breathe. I kicked off my shoes and sank onto the couch. Across the room, on a narrow bookshelf, sat a framed photograph. Grandma at 60. Her hands lifted above the Steinway keys during her final concert. The stage lights caught the curve of the piano's lid like polished black glass. I stared at that photo for a long time. My mother's words kept circling in my head. If you tell her, and something happens, that will be on you. Fear is a powerful leash. Families use it more often than they realize. I imagined walking into Grandma's hospice room and telling her the truth. Her face falling. Her heart racing. Machines beeping. And my parents standing beside a hospital bed whispering, "See what you did." But then another memory surfaced. I was 12 years old and sitting beside Grandma at the piano, crying over a math test I had failed. "I don't want to tell Mom and Dad," I had said. Grandma kept playing softly while I talked. Then she stopped and looked at me. "Truth can wound," she told me gently. "But lies wound deeper, they just take longer." That sentence echoed in my mind now like a quiet bell. I pulled my knees to my chest on the couch. For years I had convinced myself that keeping peace in my family meant staying quiet. But suddenly I could see it clearly. Silence hadn't created peace. It had only made room for worse things. By midnight, the rain had stopped. By 2 in the morning, the city outside my window had gone completely still. And at 3 o'clock, when the world is quiet enough for honesty to feel unavoidable, I made my decision. Grandma deserved the truth. Not the version my parents were telling everyone. The real one. Even if it hurt. Even if it made things messy. Even if it meant the version of me my family preferred, the small, obedient one, was about to disappear. If you've ever reached a moment like that in your life, you know how quiet it feels. Not dramatic. Just a calm realization that something inside you has shifted permanently. I set my alarm for early morning. I would go to hospice before my first lesson. I would sit beside Grandma's bed. And I would tell her everything. What I didn't know then was that my grandmother had already been waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. The truth she was waiting for. The hospice hallway was quiet when I arrived the next morning. Too quiet for the hour. The sun had barely risen, and the soft yellow lights along the ceiling made everything look a little unreal, like the world was still deciding whether it wanted to wake up. I paused outside Grandma Eleanor's room with my hand on the door. For the first time since deciding the night before, doubt crept in. What if my mother was right? What if the truth upset her too much? What if telling her made these last days harder? Fear has a strange way of dressing itself up as kindness. But then I remembered the empty space in the living room, the indentation in the carpet, the lie my father had already started telling people, and I pushed the door open. Grandma was awake. She was propped up against two pillows, looking out the window where the early sunlight stretched across the parking lot. The light softened the lines on her face, but the intelligence in her eyes was as sharp as ever. When she saw me, she smiled. "You're early, Annabelle." I pulled the chair beside her bed a little closer and sat down. "I needed to talk to you." Her gaze lingered on my face for a moment longer than usual. "You look like someone who didn't sleep." I didn't. That seemed to confirm something for her. She shifted slightly against the pillows. "Then tell me what's wrong." There was no dramatic build-up, no rehearsed speech. I just took her hand. "Grandma, I went to your house yesterday." Her fingers tightened slightly around mine. "For the photographs?" "Yes." I took a breath. "And the piano is gone." She didn't react immediately. No sharp inhale. No confusion. Just a slow blink. "I see." The calmness of her voice surprised me. So, I kept going. "The living room is empty. I called Mom, and she said Dad handled it." I watched her face carefully. Still calm. Still listening. "They sold it," I said softly, "for $95,000. A long silence filled the room. Machines hummed quietly beside the bed. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse laughed softly at something someone said. But Grandma Eleanor didn't interrupt, so I told her the rest. About the car. About Megan. About the way my father had already started presenting it as a generous gift from her. And finally, about my mother's warning. When I finished, my voice felt smaller than when I had started. I braced myself. For tears. For anger. For heartbreak. Instead, my grandmother exhaled slowly. Not the sigh of someone shocked. The sigh of someone whose suspicions had just been confirmed. "I wondered how long it would take," she said quietly. I blinked. "You wondered?" She turned her head toward me. Her eyes were calm. Too calm. "Annabelle," she said gently. "I know my son." A strange weight shifted in my chest. "You knew this might happen?" "I hoped it wouldn't," she corrected softly. But hope is not the same thing as blindness. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached toward the small bedside table. "Hand me my phone, sweetheart." Confused, I picked it up and placed it in her hand. Her fingers moved slowly but confidently across the screen. Scrolling through contacts, she stopped on one name, then pressed call. I could hear the ring through the speaker. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a man answered. "Eleanor?" His voice was older, steady, professional. "How are you feeling today?" Grandma Eleanor's voice was calm when she replied. "I'm dying, Harold." A pause. Then the man spoke again, more gently. "I understand." Grandma looked straight at me. "But my mind is clear," she continued. "And it's time." Another small silence passed on the line. "When?" the man asked. "Sunday," she said. "At Diane's birthday party." My heart skipped. The party. The one my parents had been planning for weeks. "At the house," she added. The man on the phone didn't sound surprised. "I'll prepare the documents." "Thank you, Harold." She ended the call. Then she set the phone carefully back on the table. For a moment I couldn't find my voice. "Grandma." She looked at me again. This time there was a faint smile on her lips. The kind that appears when someone has been quietly holding a secret. "Who was that?" I asked. "My attorney," she said simply. I stared at her. "You have your own attorney?" "For 30 years," she replied. Her eyes sparkled with the faintest hint of mischief. "Richard always assumed he understood everything about my affairs." She leaned back into the pillows. "That assumption has been his greatest weakness." I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Grandma, what's going to happen on Sunday? She studied my face for a moment, then squeezed my hand again. Justice, she said softly. Not revenge. Not punishment. Just one quiet word. Justice. And suddenly I had the strange feeling that my parents had made a mistake far bigger than selling a piano. The plan she never told anyone about. I didn't leave the hospice room for a long time after that call. My grandmother looked tired, but there was a calmness around her that I hadn't seen before. Not the kind of calm that comes from giving up. The kind that comes from finishing something important. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind. Sunday. My mother's birthday party. The house. Documents. None of it made sense yet. Grandma, I said carefully. What exactly is going to happen on Sunday? She tilted her head slightly against the pillow. You don't need to worry about every detail, she said. That's not very reassuring. A small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Patience, Annabelle. That word made me laugh quietly. Grandma had spent years teaching me patience at the piano. When I was 8 and wanted to skip the slow scales. When I was 13 and cried because Chopin felt impossible. When I was 17 and thought mistakes meant failure. Music teaches patience, she used to say. So does life. She watched me now with the same patient expression. I just need you to do one thing for me, she continued. Anything. Come to the party. I blinked. You want me there? Of course. She squeezed my hand lightly. Dress nicely, smile politely, and watch. Watch what? Her eyes sparkled in a way that reminded me of the woman in the photograph on her bedside table, the confident pianist on stage. Your father learning a very overdue lesson. The room went quiet again. I hesitated. Grandma, are you trying to punish them? She shook her head slowly. No. Her voice softened. I'm trying to correct something I should have corrected years ago. That answer stayed with me. Because there was no anger in it. Just regret. I watched too many things happen in this family, she said quietly. Too many moments where you were treated like you didn't matter. My throat tightened. Grandma. I kept hoping Richard would change, she continued. That Diane would see what I saw. She looked directly at me. That was my mistake. Her words carried the weight of years. 5 years ago, she added softly, I decided hope wasn't enough anymore. My mind caught on that number. 5 years? She nodded. That's when I started preparing. Preparing. The word felt heavier than it sounded. What did you prepare? I asked. But she didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked toward the window where the afternoon light had begun to fade. You know, she said slowly, people reveal their character when they believe something valuable belongs to them. Her gaze returned to mine. And your father has believed certain things for a very long time. I had the uncomfortable feeling she meant more than the piano. Annabelle, she said gently, there's something important you should understand. I leaned forward slightly. Your parents have built their lives on assumptions. What kind of assumptions? That everything I have would eventually become theirs. A quiet pause followed. And sometimes, she added softly, assumptions can be very expensive. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The entire conversation felt like standing near the edge of a puzzle I couldn't quite see yet. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the phone call. Who is Harold? Her smile returned. Harold Jennings is the man who has handled my legal affairs since your grandfather passed away. You trust him? Completely. She rested her head back against the pillow. He also happens to enjoy correcting arrogant men. Despite everything, I laughed. Then the room fell quiet again. Grandma looked more tired now. Her eyelids were heavier. But before she drifted toward sleep, she said one more thing. Annabelle. Yes? No matter what happens on Sunday, remember something. What? You didn't cause this. Her hand tightened around mine one last time. Your father did. That sentence stayed with me the entire drive home. Because for the first time since discovering the empty living room, I felt something different than anger. Curiosity. and a strange, steady certainty. Whatever my grandmother had planned for Sunday, my parents had absolutely no idea what was coming, and neither did the 30 guests they had invited to celebrate my mother's birthday. The lawyer's office. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a law office that smelled like leather, dust, and old paper. It wasn't the kind of place my parents would ever visit. My father preferred glass buildings with marble floors and assistants who carried tablets, the kind of offices designed to look impressive from the street. This place was different. Quiet. Solid. Like the people inside cared more about what was written on paper than how the room looked. A small brass plaque beside the door read, Harold Jennings, attorney at law. I sat in a wooden chair outside his office, staring at the grain in the floorboards, while my mind tried to catch up with everything that had happened in the last 48 hours. Grandma had called him. He had agreed to come to my mother's birthday party, and apparently, he had documents. A door opened down the hallway. Annabelle Thompson? I looked up. The man standing there looked exactly like the voice I remembered from the phone call. Late 60s. Silver hair. Gold-rimmed glasses. The kind of posture that suggested patience and experience rather than authority. Yes, I said, standing. He extended a hand. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Your grandmother speaks about you often. His handshake was firm but gentle. Please, he said, gesturing toward the office. Come in. The room was lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves filled with thick, legal volumes. A wide wooden desk sat near the window, covered with neat stacks of folders. Not cluttered, just organized. The office of someone who had been doing the same work for decades. He waited until I sat before taking his own chair. Your grandmother asked me to explain a few things before Sunday, he said. My stomach tightened slightly. Okay. He studied me for a moment. You look a great deal like your grandfather. I barely remember him. That's a shame, he said softly. He adored you. Then he leaned back in his chair. Eleanor Whitmore, he continued, is one of the most thoughtful clients I have ever had. Something in his tone told me this conversation was about to become much bigger than I expected. She is also, he added calmly, far more strategic than her son realizes. My heart beat a little faster. What do you mean? Instead of answering immediately, he opened a drawer and removed a thick folder. Then he slid a document across the desk toward me. Let me ask you a question first, he said. I looked down at the paper. Then back at him. Okay. Do you know who owns the house your parents live in? The question felt so obvious I almost smiled. My parents, I said. Grandma gave it to them after Grandpa died. Harold Jennings didn't smile back. Is that what they told you? The way he asked it made my chest tighten. Yes. He tapped the document in front of me. Take a closer look. My fingers felt strangely cold as I pulled the paper toward me. It was a property deed. The address was instantly familiar. My grandmother's house. The house my parents had lived in for 10 years. The house where my mother's birthday party was about to happen. I scanned the page until I found the ownership line. Then, I stopped breathing. Owner, Eleanor Whitmore. No transfer. No amendment. No additional names. Just hers. I looked up slowly. That can't be right. It is, Harold said calmly. But they've lived there for a decade. Yes. They told everyone it was theirs. He folded his hands on the desk. They were allowed to live there, he said. That's not the same thing. My head started spinning. You mean they never owned the house? Correct. They've been living there for 10 years thinking it was theirs. Correct. The room felt suddenly smaller. But why would Grandma let them believe that? Harold's expression didn't change. Because she was watching. The words landed slowly. Watching what? To see whether her son would prove her wrong. A quiet pause filled the room. He didn't, Harold said gently. I stared down at the deed again. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. My grandmother's handwriting. 5 years ago, he continued, Eleanor made several adjustments to her estate planning. My eyes lifted again. Adjustments? Yes. He opened the folder and removed another document. This, he said calmly, is where Sunday becomes very interesting. A strange feeling spread through my chest. Not fear. Not excitement. Something steadier. Because in that moment, I realized my parents hadn't just sold a piano they didn't own. They had just stepped directly into a legal trap my grandmother had been quietly building for 5 years. The envelope she left me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, because my entire understanding of my family had shifted. The house my parents had built their lives around, the place my father proudly called his property, had never belonged to him. It still belonged to my grandmother. And somehow, she had let them believe otherwise for 10 years. I kept replaying Harold Jennings's words in my head. Eleanor has been watching. Watching what? Watching my parents treat the house like their own? Watching the way they talked about money? Watching how they treated me? I sat on the floor of my apartment living room long after midnight, surrounded by a small collection of old things my grandmother had given me over the years. Concert programs, photographs, a dried flower from her garden pressed inside a book. And at the bottom of the box, something I had never opened. A yellow envelope. My name written across the front in her elegant script. Annabelle. I stared at it for a long time. I remembered when she had given me the box years ago. Just memories, she had said casually. But now, after everything Harold had told me, the envelope felt different. Like something that had been waiting quietly. I opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. It showed my grandmother standing beside the Steinway piano in her living room. But that wasn't what caught my attention. Clipped to the photograph was a single sheet of paper. A legal document. The header at the top was partially folded, but I could clearly see the signature at the bottom. Eleanor Whitmore. And attached to the corner was a handwritten note. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Because it didn't quite feel real. The note said, "The house never left my hands, sweetheart. It was only borrowed." And some borrowers forget that privilege can be taken back. My chest tightened. 5 years ago. That was when she had started planning. Not because she expected revenge. Because she expected reality. I leaned back against the couch and stared at the ceiling. The pieces were starting to connect now. My father believed the house was his. He hosted dinners there. Business meetings. Holiday parties. My mother decorated it like a trophy. They had both spent years building their image around a life that appeared successful. And now I understood something terrifying. That entire image rested on a house they didn't actually own. If that truth came out publicly, everything could collapse. Careers. Reputation. Relationships. Especially the one my father cared about most. His business partnership with Daniel Harrison's father. Appearances mattered in that world. Trust mattered even more. And suddenly, the birthday party on Sunday made perfect sense. 30 guests. Friends. Neighbors. Business partners. Witnesses. My grandmother hadn't chosen that moment by accident. She had chosen it because it would be impossible to hide the truth. If you've ever watched someone build their entire identity on something fragile, you know how quickly everything falls apart when that foundation cracks. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Then I placed it on my nightstand. Sunday was 2 days away. My parents were planning a birthday celebration. They were probably still telling people how generous Grandma had been with Megan's car. They probably believed everything was still under their control. But somewhere across town, in a quiet hospice room, my grandmother and her attorney were preparing something else entirely. Not revenge. Not anger. Just truth. And sometimes truth is the most powerful thing in the room. I turned off the lamp and lay in the dark for a long time. Because one thought kept circling through my mind. On Sunday afternoon, 30 people would walk into my grandmother's house, believing it belonged to my parents. And by the time the party ended, everyone in that room would know it never had. The morning of the party, Sunday arrived colder than expected. The kind of winter morning where sunlight looks bright, but the air still bites when you step outside. I stood in front of my closet longer than necessary, staring at dresses I rarely wore. Grandma's voice echoed in my head. Wear something that makes you feel strong. So I chose the navy blue dress she once said made me look like someone who knows her own worth. It was simple, elegant, quiet, very much like her. Before leaving, I paused beside the envelope on my nightstand. The letter she wrote, the one reminding me the house had never actually belonged to my parents. I didn't need to bring it. Harold Jennings would bring the real documents. Still, I touched the envelope once, like a small reminder to myself. Today wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. When I drove toward my grandmother's house, cars were already lining the street. My mother had clearly planned a large celebration. Guests were walking toward the front door carrying wine bottles and wrapped gifts. From the outside, everything looked normal. Perfect, even. White porch railings. Winter sunlight on the windows. The same house my father proudly introduced as his home for 10 years. Except now I knew something the guests didn't. It wasn't his house. Not legally. Not ever. And inside that house, somewhere among the laughter and birthday decorations, sat a man with a leather briefcase. Waiting. If you're listening to this and have ever walked into a room knowing something others didn't, you understand the strange calm that comes with it. Because the moment truth arrives, everything changes. And sometimes the people who are the most confident in the room are the ones about to lose the most. The empty corner. The house buzzed with conversation the moment I stepped inside. About 30 people had already gathered. Aunts, neighbors, two of my father's business associates. And near the fireplace, Daniel Harrison stood beside his father, talking quietly while Megan laughed at something he said. The moment my sister spotted me, her smile tightened. "Anna," she said loudly, "you made it." Her tone carried the same sweetness that always felt slightly rehearsed. I nodded politely. "Happy birthday to Mom." Across the room, my mother stood near the dining table in a red dress, accepting compliments like a queen receiving visitors. "60 looks wonderful on you," someone said. She laughed and touched her necklace. Then my eyes drifted toward the corner of the living room, the place where the Steinway had lived for 3 decades. Someone had tried to hide the emptiness. A large potted plant stood there now. Tall, green, ridiculous. Like a quiet apology for something that couldn't be replaced. I stared at it longer than I meant to. "Anna." A voice beside me made me turn. Harold Jennings stood there. Same calm posture. Same measured expression. A leather briefcase rested beside his leg. "Good afternoon," he said quietly. My heart beat a little faster. "You came." "Of course." He followed my gaze to the empty corner. "The piano's absence is noticeable." "That was their solution," I said. "Plants rarely replace history," he replied. Then he leaned slightly closer. "Are you ready?" I looked around the room. At my parents. At Megan. At the guests laughing with glasses of wine. Then I nodded slowly. "Yes." Harold closed his briefcase with a soft click. "Good," he said. "Because the truth usually arrives when people least expect it." The announcement. Half an hour later, my father clinked a glass. The room slowly quieted. He stood in the center of the living room, smiling like a man completely in control. "Everyone," he said warmly, "thank you for coming to celebrate Diane's 60th birthday." Applause followed. My mother beamed. Dad raised his glass again. "But we also have another reason to celebrate." My stomach tightened. I already knew where this was going. "As many of you know," he continued, "our daughter Megan has been seeing Daniel Harrison." He gestured toward them proudly. Daniel nodded politely. "And because her future is so promising?" He paused for effect. "We have a small surprise." Guests murmured with curiosity. Dad led everyone toward the front door. When it opened, the driveway came into view. And there it was. The silver Mercedes. Bright red bow across the hood. Megan squealed. Oh my God. She ran toward the car as guests followed behind, laughing and applauding. My father stood proudly beside it. This gift, he announced loudly, was made possible by Eleanor's generosity. My hands went cold. Grandma sold her antique piano, he continued smoothly. She wanted Megan to start her adult life with something special. Camera flashes lit the driveway. Megan hugged him dramatically. Thank you, Dad. Behind the crowd, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not even shock. Just the quiet understanding that my father had made this moment impossible to undo. Because he hadn't lied privately. He had lied in front of 30 witnesses. And sometimes the louder the lie, the louder the truth becomes when it finally arrives. The first crack. When everyone returned inside, the atmosphere felt slightly different. Not tense, just curious. Because a few people had clearly heard rumors about the piano. Near the doorway, Aunt Margaret approached my father. Richard, she said carefully. Yes? Did Eleanor really want the piano sold? The room didn't go silent, but conversations nearby slowed. My father smiled confidently. Of course. She said that? Absolutely. Margaret crossed her arms. That's strange. Dad's smile faltered slightly. Why? Because I spoke to her this morning. The room quieted. She told me she never agreed to sell it. For a moment no one spoke. My mother stepped forward quickly. Margaret, she said sharply. This isn't the time. But Margaret didn't move. I just asked a question. My father laughed lightly. Mother is confused these days. She sounded very clear to me. A whisper moved through the guests. And that was the moment Harold Jennings stood up from his chair. He picked up his briefcase, then walked calmly toward the center of the room. Actually, he said, I believe this conversation would benefit from some clarification. 30 faces turned toward him. My name is Harold Jennings, he continued calmly. I'm Eleanor Whitmore's attorney. And suddenly, the room went completely silent. The deed. My father stared at him. My mother has an attorney? 30 years, Harold replied calmly. I also represented your father. Murmurs spread across the room. Harold opened his briefcase slowly. Eleanor asked me to address a few matters today. He removed a document. This, he said, holding it up, is the deed to this property. The paper rested on the dining table where everyone could see it. Notice the owner listed here. My father stepped forward. His face had already started to pale. Eleanor Whitmore. Whispers rippled through the room. This house, Harold continued, has never been transferred to Richard or Diane Thompson. My mother's voice trembled. That's ridiculous. Harold remained calm. You have been living here for 10 years. He paused. But legally speaking, his voice carried clearly through the room. You are tenants. Gasps filled the space. And outside the window, the silver Mercedes sat quietly in the driveway, still wearing its red bow. The trust. The silence in the room stretched for several seconds. My father finally found his voice. This is absurd, he said. My mother promised us this house. Harold nodded politely. She allowed you to live here. That is not the same as ownership. My mother stepped forward. You can't humiliate us like this. I'm not humiliating anyone, Harold replied calmly. I'm clarifying legal reality. Then he removed another document. 5 years ago, Eleanor Whitmore created a private trust. My father's face tightened. A trust? Yes. Harold placed the paper on the table. This trust protects her financial assets and property. The room held its breath, and it names a single beneficiary. My father's voice cracked slightly. Who? Harold looked up. Directly at me. Annabelle Rose Thompson. The room erupted. Megan gasped. My mother stared at me like I had just betrayed them. But I hadn't moved. I was still standing near the empty corner where the piano used to be. And suddenly everyone understood something at the same time. The quiet daughter they had ignored for years was the person who now owned everything. The piano. My father pointed at me. She manipulated her. Harold's expression didn't change. Your mother signed these documents 5 years ago. He lifted another paper. Which brings us to the piano. The air in the room felt heavy. That instrument, Harold continued, was listed as a protected trust asset. Megan's voice shook. But we sold it. Yes, Harold said calmly. Without authorization. My father rubbed his face. What does that mean? It means the $95,000 must be returned to the trust. Gasps spread through the guests. Megan's voice rose. That's impossible. The money bought the car. Harold nodded toward the window. Then the car can be sold. Her face turned pale. My car? Legally speaking, Harold said, it was never yours. Outside, the Mercedes gleamed in the winter sunlight, still decorated with a bow. Suddenly, it didn't look like a celebration. It looked like evidence. Consequences. The room slowly filled with whispers. Daniel Harrison stepped a little farther away from Megan. His father's expression had changed completely. My father noticed. James, he said quickly, this is just a misunderstanding. James Harrison didn't smile. You sold your mother's property without permission. Dad opened his mouth, but no words came. Harold continued calmly. If the money is not returned within 30 days, legal action will begin. My mother's voice cracked. You can't do this to family. Harold closed his folder. Mrs. Thompson, these consequences were created by your family. The truth hung in the room like heavy air. For the first time in my life, my parents had no explanation, no control, just silence. And sometimes silence is the loudest moment in the room. A different choice. Later, when most of the guests had quietly left, Harold spoke with me near the dining table. You have the right to remove them from the property immediately, he said. I looked across the room. My father sat in a chair staring at the floor. My mother stood by the window, mascara streaking down her cheeks. For years I had imagined confronting them. Imagined anger. Victory. But the truth felt quieter than that. I don't want them thrown out, I said. Harold studied me. You're certain? Yes. I took a slow breath. They can stay for now, but they'll sign a lease. And the money? They return it. He nodded slowly. Your grandmother predicted this answer. I looked toward the empty corner again. She knew me better than anyone. Goodbye. 3 weeks later, the hospice nurse called early in the morning. You should come now. When I arrived, Grandma was awake, but very tired. Her hand felt fragile in mine. You did well, she whispered. You knew what would happen. She smiled softly. I knew what kind of person you are. Tears blurred my vision. I wish you had more time. So do I, she said gently. Then she looked toward the window. But this was enough. Her fingers squeezed mine once more. Play music, she whispered. And live well. That evening, she slipped away quietly. Just as the sun disappeared beyond the hospital windows. The real inheritance. 6 months later, I moved into the house. The first thing I placed in the living room was a new piano. Not the old Steinway. Something simpler. But beautiful. Every evening, music filled the house again. Sometimes students came for lessons. Sometimes I played just for myself. My parents eventually moved out. They said the house held too many memories. Maybe they were right. Because every corner reminded me of something my grandmother had taught me. Not about money, not about property. About dignity. About knowing your worth. And about the quiet strength it takes to finally stop being invisible. Sometimes people think inheritance means money, or houses, or things. But my grandmother left me something much more valuable than that. She left me the courage to stand up for myself. And if you've ever had to do the same, tell me in the comments. Because stories like this remind us of one simple truth. Respect is never something you beg for. It's something you decide to keep.